Hi guys, it's Roseanne. I'm going to talk to you about big picture revision today, and to do that, I'm gonna do that in my winter studio. So here's where I work in the winter time, in this studio in my backyard, and we'll go in and take a look. I devised this big picture revision strategy because although it's easy for me to think about my book in terms of a chapter at a time, holding an entire novel in my head I find pretty challenging. So, so I developed this big picture revision strategy. This is my studio. I have maps and books. And my work desk is an old woodworking bench of my husband's. So when I'm looking at big picture strategy, the first thing that I do is I make my manuscript as small as I can possibly make it. So what I do is I go here to my manuscript on the screen, and I go over to the toolbox, and I go here to size, and I make it 8-point type, as small a size as you can get. I make sure under line spacing that it's single spaced. I go down here to document margins, and I shrink down the margin as small as I can make it. 0.2 is usually as small as you can make it and still print. And then I go through the document and make sure that I take out all the spaces between chapters, right? So that everything is as close together as I can make it. And then I print the whole thing, because what I want to do is I want to look at the whole story all in one spot. So my favorite thing about my studio is I have this big wall on the back that's completely blank. And it's big enough that I can post an entire story on it. So this is Logan's story, one of my works in progress. And it's 52,000 words. But when I do this small type method, I can get the whole story onto 48 pages. And then I just tape them up on the wall like this. And the first thing that I do when I look at the whole story is just think of it in terms of balance. You know how we talked about having a balance between dialogue and narration? I can see that I've got some spots here with lots of room on the page that are almost entirely dialogue, right? And then I can see that I've got other spots that are very heavy on the narration, right? Here's another spot down here that's almost entirely narration, right? Not that those are good or bad, but it just helps me take a look at the whole story and the balance of what I've got going on, right? The third thing that I do is I notice character introductions and setting shifts in my story. So I've used pink flags for character introduction and orange flags for setting. So on my very first page here in the corner, I've got 3 pink flags for my first 3 characters that I introduce, and that orange flag says Seattle because that's where my story opens. I think as a general rule, introducing 2 to 4 characters at a time is a good idea. More than 5 can be tricky. It's possible, but it's tricky to introduce many, many characters at once. And then as I go along, I have another cluster of 3 characters that are introduced in the 3rd chapter. And then the next row down, I have another cluster of 3 characters that are introduced right by, this is the quarter point of my story. That's a fourth of the way through. As a general rule, it's a good idea to get your major characters all introduced as in the first quarter of the story if you can. I have a few more characters introduced here, but they're not major characters. There's a minor character introduced here, 2 more minor characters there, and because the final scenes in the story involve a courtroom, there's the judge at the very end. But that gives me some idea of where my characters are introduced. As I said, the story starts in Seattle. Relatively quickly, it moves to Shaw Island, and for the most part of the balance of the whole story, it stays on Shaw Island for most of the time. If I had a setting shift every page or every other page, I might think about whether that's too much to ask my characters to hop around like that. But getting it all set out gives me a quick way to look at the shifts that I'm asking my reader to make. The 4th thing that I do is I mark the plot points of the story. If you remember when we were talking about outlining and plotting, Because this story is very much about the hero's journey, I'm going to use the hero's journey plot elements. Okay, so as I'm going through my story, back up here at the beginning, right, there's my inciting incident right there at the end of chapter 1, right? And then moving along, crossing the threshold comes next. If you notice, it happens right here where we're changing to the new setting. And very shortly after we cross the threshold, Logan meets his mentor. But then I notice that I've got a stretch of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about 8 pages here without another plot point, right? We've got a couple of more clustered together, right? There are 2 more plot points where Logan is telling a lie about his pain, right? And then there's another plot point here where he has a setback involving anger. And then I've got a second stretch of 6 or 8 pages where there isn't another plot point. So that's another part of the story that I'm going to think about. Can I tighten that area up? Do I really need all of those chapters? But then, in the second half of the book, the pace picks up. There's another plot point involving anger, and another plot point involving fear. And in the last quarter of the book, there's 1, 2, 3 plot points right in a row. And if you look at those last 2 pages, we've got the climax of the story is right here, and then the resolution is right there at the end. So I like at the end, I'm really happy with how this is, the climax is right at the end of the story, and the resolution follows quickly after that. That's really great. I think the inciting incident and crossing the threshold and meeting the mentor also happens right where it should. But then in the middle, because I've laid it out this way, I can see 2 spots where I'm going to look more carefully about whether I can tighten the story up. The last thing that I do is I highlight the content of the story. So if you've noticed, there's a bunch of colors up there, and I have a little key for that, right? So I used green to mark setting, and if you look at the story as a whole, there's a little bit of setting throughout, because I want my reader always to feel like they know where they are, right? And I like my setting a lot. It's a really beautiful place, the San Juan Islands, so it's fun to describe. So I've got a little bit of setting throughout, but if you notice, there's seldom, this is about the longest chunk of setting you ever see. Usually setting is just a line here, or a couple of lines there, right? A little bit more there. But it's seldom a big chunk of description. I use orange for emotional intensity, right? So if you notice around the inciting incident up here, there's quite a bit of emotional intensity around the inciting incident, right? I try and make sure that there's some emotional intensity going through the whole story. And then by far, the largest chunk of, there's orange by the major plot points, right? This setback involving anger, and this setback involving anger, and this one involving fear. All has quite a lot of orange about it. But then if you look, the most orange part of the whole book is that section that leads right up to the climax, right there, right? So, so that's working pretty well, right? The blue in the story is physical action, and particularly because this is a boy's story, I want to make sure that there's a good amount of physical action throughout the story, right? And if you remember, at the beginning we were looking at this spot down here that had no dialogue in it whatsoever, right? It doesn't have any dialogue, but if you look at that stretch of pages, it's got a lot of action in it, right? And it happens right at this plot point where he runs away. So he's run away and he's all by himself. It doesn't make sense that he'd be talking to anybody alone, right? But that action keeps things moving along, right? If it was all backstory that tied together, that would be more of a problem, right? Then the yellow is a color I use to mark both internal thought of the viewpoint character and also backstory. So you could divide that out into 2 colors if you want, but I've only got 5 colors, so I lump those 2 together. So you need some of your character's thoughts throughout the story, from beginning to end, right? But one of the things that I noticed right here at the halfway point, you remember where I had this stretch with not a lot of plot points? I also noticed that I've got a lot of backstory here and here and here. A ton of that stretch with no plot points is also backstory. So when I go back and revise this myself, I'm going to take a particular look at that section. It's not a bad thing to have some backstory at about the halfway point of your story, but that's a lot all in a bunch. So I'm going to take a look at that. The last color is pink for humor. This is a pretty serious story, so it's important to me that it has some humor throughout. And one of the things that I noticed when I was going through this, I have this section around the first quarter of the story that doesn't have a lot of plot points, but it's got a lot of humor. It's got a bunch up here and a little more down there, some humor there, and there, and there, and there. So even though it's a little bit light on the plot points throughout, as I'm maybe editing that, I want to make sure I don't lose that humor because it gives a good balance to the emotional intensity and physical action that happens in the story. So that's big picture revision, right? The first step, just to recap, is to make your manuscript as small as you can possibly make it on the page and print it out. And then find a way to lay it out and look at the whole story. If you haven't got a wall like this, you might use a bed or extend out your dining room table as far as you can and see if you can lay them all out flat. The next thing I do is I notice and I maybe mark with a little flag where I introduce characters and where the setting shifts from one spot to another. I mark the major plot points, step number 4, and then the last thing I do is I highlight the content of the story. These are the categories that I used to highlight my own story. You can use those yourself or use whatever categories make sense to you that'll help you think about your story in the big picture. So I hope that's all helpful. Take care. Bye.